long before the great kingdoms of Israel were built, long before the laws of Moses were written, or the kings of Jerusalem ruled from their stone palaces, there lived a man who walked across deserts guided only by a promise from God. His name was Abraham, and his journey would begin in an ancient city surrounded by rivers, temples, and busy trade roads. Yet it would lead him far away into unknown lands, where no map could guide his steps. Welcome tonight to a quiet journey through one of the most important stories in the entire Bible. In this story we will follow the life of Abraham, the man Scripture calls the father of many nations, and the one through whom a great promise began to unfold. We will travel with him from the ancient city of yore, across deserts and valleys, through moments of faith, doubt, and extraordinary encounters with God. Along the way we will see the covenant that changed history, the birth of a long-awaited son, and the quiet tests that shaped the life of a man who chose to trust the voice that called him. Tonight we will move step by step through Abraham's life. We will begin in the early world, described in the book of Genesis, when families traveled with flocks and lived in tents across the wide lands of Mesopotamia and Canaan. We will see how Abraham first heard the call that would change the course of his life, why he left the safety of his homeland, and how his journey across the ancient world eventually became one of the central stories of faith recorded in Scripture. Few people realize how uncertain Abraham's journey truly was. When the call came, he was not given a detailed map or a clear explanation of what lay ahead. Instead, he was told something very simple and very difficult at the same time. Leave your country, your people, and your father's household, and go to the land I will show you. That command would begin a journey that crossed hundreds of miles and many years, shaping not only Abraham's life, but the history of entire nations. Before we begin this story, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to Sleep Tight if you enjoy calm biblical journeys like this one. And tell me in the comments where you are listening from and what time it is there right now. I always enjoy seeing how far these nighttime stories travel around the world. And one more question for tonight. Which moment from Abraham's life do you find the most powerful? His call, the covenant, or the test with Isaac? Now the world of Genesis is quiet and ancient again, and our journey begins in a city that once stood along the rivers of Mesopotamia. Long before Abraham became known as the man who walked with God, he lived an ordinary life in one of the most advanced cities of the ancient world. The city was called Ur, and it stood in the southern region of Mesopotamia, near the slow-moving waters of the Euphrates River. In Abraham's time, Ur was not a small desert settlement or a quiet village of tents. It was a thriving urban center filled with houses built from sun-baked bricks, crowded streets where merchants traded goods from distant lands, and towering temples dedicated to the many gods worshipped by the people of the region. The city rose above the surrounding plain with impressive structures that could be seen from far away. At its center stood a massive stepped temple known as a monumental tower built to honor the moon god worshipped by the people of Europe. Priests climbed its long stairways each day to perform rituals, while smoke from burning offerings drifted upward into the sky. Around this temple complex spread a network of narrow streets lined with homes, workshops, and markets where traders exchanged wool, grain, metal tools, and pottery brought by caravans traveling across Mesopotamia. Abraham, who was known then by the name Abram, belonged to a large extended family that had lived in this region for many generations. His father was Terah, a man who oversaw the family's household and managed their property and livestock. Like many families in the ancient world, they lived closely together, sharing work, resources, and responsibilities. Their daily life followed the rhythms of the seasons, tending animals, trading goods, and maintaining the household that supported everyone in the family group. The world Abram knew in Ur was busy and structured, shaped by long traditions that had existed for centuries before he was born. Caravans regularly passed through the city carrying goods between Mesopotamia and distant lands. Craftsmen worked with bronze tools, potters shaped clay vessels, and scribes recorded business transactions on clay tablets, using a writing system known as cuneiform. The city was connected to a wide network of trade routes that stretched across the fertile lands between the great rivers. Religion was woven into nearly every part of life in Ur. Temples stood throughout the city, and many families kept small household idols that represented the gods they believed protected their homes and businesses. Festivals, sacrifices, and rituals filled the calendar as priests sought favor from the many deities thought to control the forces of nature, the fertility of the land, and the success of the people. In this environment, Abram lived what appeared to be a stable and predictable life. His family had roots in the region, their work supported them comfortably, and the great city around them provided security and opportunity. Nothing about Abram's early life suggested that he would one day leave this powerful city behind and begin a journey across unknown lands, guided only by a promise from the God who would call him. Yet far beyond the crowded streets of Ur and the temples that dominated the city's skyline, a moment was approaching that would quietly interrupt the ordinary rhythm of Abram's life. And when that moment arrived, everything about his future would begin to change. Although Abram's life in the city of Ur appeared stable and secure, the book of Genesis hints that a change had already begun quietly forming within his family. The ancient city that had supported them for generations was not the place where their story would ultimately continue. At some point during Abram's early adult years, his father Terah made the decision to leave Ur and begin traveling north with the family toward a region known as Haran, a city located along an important trade route in northern Mesopotamia. The reasons behind this decision are not fully explained in the biblical text, but in the ancient world, such movements were not unusual. Families often migrated with their flocks and possessions when trade opportunities changed, when land became less productive, or when new routes promised better prospects for the future. For Abram and his relatives, the journey would mean leaving behind the familiar streets of Ur and traveling across long stretches of open land toward a distant city they had never seen. The departure itself would not have happened quickly. Moving an entire household in the ancient world required careful preparation. Abram's family would have gathered their animals, tents, tools, and supplies for a journey that could take weeks or even months, depending on the route and the conditions of the land. Caravans often followed established paths along rivers and fertile valleys, avoiding the harsher desert regions whenever possible. Genesis describes how the family group included Abram, his wife Sarai, and his nephew Lot, along with Terah and the rest of the extended household. Together they began traveling northward, following the great arc of land known today as the Fertile Crescent. This route curved between the rivers of Mesopotamia and the distant lands of Canaan, providing access to water, pasture for animals, and settlements where travelers could rest and trade. The journey from Ur to Haran would have taken them through a landscape very different from the city they had left behind. Instead of brick houses and crowded markets, the road passed through wide plains, where shepherds guided their flocks across open grasslands. Rivers and seasonal streams shaped the terrain, and travelers moved carefully between settlements where wells and food supplies could be found. At night, the caravan would stop to rest, raising tents beneath the wide sky, while fires flickered in the darkness. Eventually, the family arrived in Haran, a city that shared some similarities with Ur. Like Abram's former home, Haran was also a center of trade and worship, and it too was known for its devotion to the moon god. The settlement stood at an important crossroads for merchants, traveling between Mesopotamia and the lands to the west. For Abram's family, Haran offered a place where they could rebuild their household and continue their work among other travelers and traders moving through the region. For a time, it seemed that Haran might become their permanent home. The family settled there, their animals found pasture, and life returned to a familiar rhythm of work and daily responsibilities. But the quiet years in Haran were only a pause in Abram's journey, because it was there, in that distant city, far from Ur, that Abram would hear a voice that would call him to leave everything he knew once again. And this time the journey would not simply follow trade roads between cities. It would lead him toward a land that God himself would promise to show him. For some time after Abram and his family settled in Haran, life likely returned to a rhythm that felt stable and familiar. The city stood along a busy trade route connecting Mesopotamia to the lands farther west, and travelers from distant regions regularly passed through its markets and streets. Caravans carrying wool, grain, metals, and crafted goods moved steadily through the region, stopping to rest near the wells and open pastures that surrounded the settlement. For Abram and his household, Haran provided a place where their animals could graze and their family could rebuild the life they had left behind in Europe. The biblical text does not describe these years in great detail, but it suggests that Abram had become a respected head of his household by this time. His flocks had grown, his servants worked under his direction, and his family lived within the familiar traditions of the region. Like many people in the ancient world, Abram would have spent his days managing livestock, organizing the movement of his household, and negotiating small exchanges of goods or animals with neighboring families. It was a life that required patience, practical wisdom, and careful attention to the changing seasons. Yet something about Abram's life remained unresolved. The book of Genesis quietly mentions that Abram and his wife Sarai had no children, a fact that carried deep significance in the ancient world. Families depended on children to continue their lineage, protect their property, and preserve their name for future generations. For a man who had already reached an advanced age by the standards of his time, the absence of an heir would have been a constant source of quiet concern. It was during this period of settled life in Haran that something extraordinary occurred. Genesis records the moment with remarkable simplicity. There was no great ceremony, no gathering of witnesses, and no elaborate introduction. Instead, the text simply states that the Lord spoke to Abram in the quiet rhythm of his ordinary life. Abram heard a call that would redirect the entire course of his future. The message was both clear and demanding. The Lord said to Abram, "Go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land I will show you." The instruction required Abram to leave behind the security of everything he had known, his extended family, the familiar trade routes, and the city that had become his home. The command did not include a detailed map or a clear explanation of where he would ultimately settle. Instead, Abram was asked to begin walking toward a destination that would only be revealed step by step. Yet the call did not end with that command alone. God also spoke a promise that reached far beyond Abram's present circumstances. The Lord declared that Abram would become the father of a great nation, and that through him all the families of the earth would be blessed. The promise seemed almost impossible when measured against Abram's current reality. He was already advanced in years, and he and Sarai had no children. Nothing in his situation suggested that such a future could realistically unfold. And yet the voice that called Abram carried an authority that demanded a response. The quiet years in Haran had come to an end. A journey unlike any he had taken before was about to begin. The command Abram received in Haran was simple in its wording, but immense in its implications. Leaving one's homeland in the ancient world was not a small decision made lightly or quickly. Family ties defined identity, protection, and belonging, and the household of a patriarch often represented generations of shared history and responsibility. To depart from that network meant stepping into a future that offered no guarantees of safety, stability, or success. Yet the voice that spoke to Abram did not only give him a command to leave, it also spoke a promise that reached far beyond the immediate journey. According to the account preserved in Genesis, the Lord told Abram that he would make him into a great nation, bless him, and make his name great. Abram was also told that those who blessed him would be blessed, and those who opposed him would face consequences. Most remarkable of all was the final part of the promise. All peoples on earth will be blessed through you. These words suggested that Abram's journey was not only about his own life or family. It pointed towards something larger, something that would extend across generations and nations yet to come. From a human perspective, the promise must have seemed almost impossible to imagine. Abram was already well advanced in years, and Sarai had not been able to bear children. The household they led included servants and relatives, but there was no heir who could continue Abram's family line. In the practical world of ancient tribal societies, The idea of becoming the ancestor of a great nation required something Abram did not yet possess: a son who would carry the family forward. Yet the biblical narrative presents Abram's response with remarkable calm. The text does not describe long debates or extended hesitation. Instead, Genesis simply records that Abram chose to act on the words he had heard. Whether the decision formed slowly over many days of thought or arrived with sudden clarity, the result was the same. Abram prepared to leave Haran and begin the journey toward the land God had promised to show him. The preparation for such a departure would have required careful planning. Abram was not traveling alone as a single wanderer crossing the desert. He led a large household that included Sarai, his nephew Lot, servants who worked with their flocks, and the many animals that provided their livelihood. Tents, tools, supplies, and livestock all had to be organized into a traveling caravan capable of moving safely across long distances. The route Abram would follow led southwest from Haran toward the region known in Scripture as Canaan, a land described in the Bible as rich with valleys, hills, and fertile plains. Caravans traveling that direction often followed established paths along rivers and trade routes, moving slowly through territories controlled by different tribes and city-states. The journey required patience, resilience, and the ability to navigate unfamiliar lands where the customs and languages of the people might differ from those Abram had known in Mesopotamia. When everything was finally prepared, Abram did something that would define his legacy for thousands of years. He left. Genesis summarizes the moment in a simple sentence that is echoed throughout biblical history. So, Abram went, as the Lord had told him. With those words, the journey of faith truly began. Abram was 75 years old when he departed from Haran. The road ahead would lead him across deserts, valleys, and encounters he could not yet imagine, and the promise that had begun with a single voice in Haran would slowly unfold across the years of his life. The decision to leave Haran was not merely a personal change in Abram's life. It meant moving an entire household across a vast and uncertain landscape. In the ancient world, a household like Abram's included far more than a husband and wife. It involved servants, shepherds, animals, tents, tools, and supplies necessary for survival during long periods of travel. Preparing such a caravan required careful organization and patience, because once the journey began, there would be long stretches of land where food, water, and safe shelter were not easily found. Abram gathered everything that belonged to his household: his flocks, his possessions, the servants who worked under his leadership, and the family members who depended on him, and prepared to step away from the city that had become their home. At his side traveled Sarai, his wife, and Lot, the son of Abram's brother, who had grown up within the same extended family. Together they would cross hundreds of miles of unfamiliar territory toward a land Abram had never seen but had been told to trust. The caravan that left Haran likely followed one of the well-known routes that curved southward through the lands of the Fertile Crescent, the great arc of fertile territory that connected Mesopotamia with the regions of Syria and Canaan. These ancient paths were used by traders, shepherds, and migrating families who moved between settlements in search of pasture and opportunity. Traveling along these routes meant moving slowly, allowing animals to graze and ensuring that the entire household could keep pace across the open terrain. Days would begin early as the caravan set out under the rising sun, and evenings would end with tents raised beneath the wide sky while fires flickered quietly against the darkening horizon. The journey was long enough that Abram and his household would have seen the landscape gradually change around them, from the river valleys of Mesopotamia to the rolling hills and dry plains that stretched toward the lands of Canaan. Throughout this journey, Abram carried the promise that had been spoken to him in Haran, even though nothing around him yet confirmed what the future would hold. There were no visible signs that he would become the father of a great nation, no evidence that the distant land ahead would one day belong to his descendants. Instead, Abram's path required a different kind of certainty, one built not on visible proof, but on trust in the voice that had called him to leave everything familiar behind. Each mile of travel became an act of quiet faith, Each campsite beneath the stars a reminder that the journey itself was unfolding step by step rather than all at once. Abram could not see the full shape of the promise, but he continued moving forward across the ancient world, leading his household toward a land that God had said would one day belong to his descendants. Eventually, the long journey brought Abram and his caravan into the region the Bible calls Canaan, a land of valleys, hills, scattered settlements, and fertile areas where different tribes lived among fortified towns and small agricultural communities. For Abram, this was the place God had promised to show him. Though it was already inhabited by people who had lived there for generations, the arrival in Canaan marked a new stage in Abram's life, because the wandering journey that had begun in Haran had now brought him into the land where the promise would begin unfolding in ways he could not yet imagine. The road from Haran had ended, but the deeper story of Abram's calling was only beginning. When Abram and his household finally entered the land of Canaan, the journey that had begun in Haran reached an important turning point, though the story itself was only beginning. The land stretched before them as a varied landscape of hills, valleys, and open plains, where seasonal rains nourished crops and grazing animals. Small cities and fortified settlements dotted the region, each surrounded by fields and vineyards, worked by the people who had lived there for generations. For Abram and those traveling with him, this was unfamiliar territory, a land already occupied by tribes and communities whose customs, languages, and alliances formed a complex network across the countryside. Genesis explains that the Canaanites were living in the land at that time, meaning Abram did not arrive as a conqueror or ruler, but as a traveler and a newcomer. His household moved through the region as a wandering clan of shepherds, guiding their flocks from place to place in search of pasture and water. The rhythm of this life required patience and attentiveness to the land itself. Wells had to be located, grazing areas carefully chosen, and camps established where the animals could feed safely while the family rested beneath the shade of trees or the cover of their tents. One of the first places Abram reached was a location near Shet, beside a notable landmark known in the biblical text as the Oak of Moreh. In the ancient world, large trees like this often served as gathering places where travelers rested and communities marked significant events. It was here, according to Genesis, that the Lord appeared again to Abram and spoke words that clarified the promise first. Given in Haran, God declared, "To your offspring I will give this land." The statement carried enormous significance because it connected Abram's personal journey with a future that would extend far beyond his own lifetime. In response to this moment, Abram did something that would become a repeated pattern throughout his travels in Canaan. He built an altar to the Lord at the place where the promise had been spoken. In the biblical world, building an altar was an act of recognition and worship, marking a location where God had revealed something important. Stones would be gathered and arranged carefully, creating a simple structure that stood as a visible reminder of the encounter. For Abram, the altar at Shechem represented the beginning of a relationship with God that would shape the rest of his life. After leaving that location, Abram continued moving through the land, eventually setting up his tents in the hill country between Bethel and Ai. The journey through Canaan was not a quick settlement in one fixed location. Instead, Abram traveled gradually across the region, exploring the valleys and highlands while managing his flocks and household. At Bethel, he built another altar and called upon the name of the Lord, reinforcing the pattern that had begun at Shechem. Each altar marked a place where Abram paused not only to rest, but to remember the promise that had brought him into the land. Although Abram now stood within the territory God had promised to his descendants, the future of that promise was still hidden. The land belonged to other peoples, and Abram himself remained a traveler, moving between campsites rather than a landowner establishing permanent cities. The unfolding of God's promise would take time, years, generations, and events that Abram could not yet foresee. But the journey that began with a single call in Haran had now brought him into the land where that promise would slowly begin to take shape. The man who had left everything familiar behind was now living as a wanderer in a new land, guided only by the voice that had called him to trust. And soon, the path ahead would lead him into a challenge that would test both his patience and his faith. Although Abram had now entered the land that God had promised to show him, life in Canaan did not immediately become easier or more certain. The promise that his descendants would one day inherit this land stood in quiet contrast to the reality Abram could see around him. Cities were already established across the region, surrounded by cultivated fields and guarded by walls that protected the communities living inside them. The people who lived there had their own customs, leaders, and territories. And Abram's household moved among them not as owners of the land, but as wandering shepherds seeking pasture for their animals. For Abram and his family, daily life followed the steady rhythm of a traveling household. Tents had to be raised and taken down. Flocks had to be guided across open land where grass and water could still be found. And servants worked continuously to care for the animals that provided the household's livelihood. Abram was responsible not only for his own family, but also for everyone who lived and worked under his leadership. Each decision about where to travel or where to settle temporarily had consequences for the safety and survival of the entire group. The hill country where Abram camped between Bethel and Ai offered grazing land for his animals, but it also reminded him constantly that he remained a foreigner in this region. The valleys below contained towns and settlements where the Canaanite people carried out their daily work, cultivating fields and managing their own livestock. Trade occasionally took place between wandering shepherds and settled communities, but the boundaries between these groups were clearly understood. Abram's household belonged to the open land, moving slowly between pastures, while the cities remained fixed in their established territories. Despite these realities, Abram continued building altars and calling upon the name of the Lord wherever he traveled. These altars served as reminders of the promise that had brought him to this land in the first place. Each time Abram stopped to build one, he was acknowledging that the journey he had begun was not simply about finding better grazing land or securing prosperity for his household. It was about trusting the word God had spoken, even when the visible circumstances around him suggested that fulfillment of that promise might lie far in the future. Yet the challenges of living as a wandering household in a land already inhabited soon began to appear. Seasons changed, and the land sometimes struggled to support both the settled populations and the flocks of traveling shepherds who passed through the region. Rainfall could vary from year to year, affecting the growth of grass and crops. When these changes occurred, families who depended on the land for survival often had to make difficult decisions about where to move next. It was during one of these difficult seasons that Abram faced his first major challenge since entering Canaan. A famine began to spread across the land, affecting the valleys and grazing areas where Abram's animals depended on the grass for food. The fields that supported nearby settlements also suffered, and the scarcity of resources made survival uncertain for everyone living in the region. For a wandering household like Abram's, the effects of such a famine could quickly become dangerous. The land that God had promised was now struggling to sustain life, and Abram would soon be forced to decide where to lead his people next. The famine that spread across Canaan placed Abram in a difficult position as the leader of a large household responsible for the safety of many people and animals. In ancient pastoral societies, survival depended heavily on the condition of the land, and when rain failed or crops weakened, entire regions could struggle to sustain both settled communities and traveling shepherds. The hills and valleys where Abram had been grazing his flocks began to show signs of scarcity, and the grass that fed his animals grew thinner with each passing week. For a household that depended on livestock for food, trade, and wealth, remaining in a region suffering from famine could quickly lead to disaster. Abram knew that when famine struck Canaan, travelers often looked toward Egypt, a land whose stability depended on the steady flow of the Nile River rather than the uncertain rainfall of the surrounding regions. Each year, the Nile flooded its banks and deposited rich soil across the fields, allowing Egyptian farmers to grow crops even when neighboring lands faced drought. Because of this natural cycle, Egypt often became a refuge for people from surrounding territories when famine spread across the Near East. Caravans regularly traveled south toward the fertile valley of the Nile, seeking grain and supplies that could sustain their households during difficult seasons. Faced with the growing scarcity in Canaan, Abram made the practical decision to lead his household toward Egypt until the famine passed. The journey would take them across dry lands and along well-known routes used by traders and travelers moving between the two regions. Abram's caravan likely traveled slowly, guiding their flocks carefully through the terrain, while searching for water sources and safe places to rest along the way. The movement of such a large group required careful planning, and Abram would have remained constantly aware of the responsibility he carried as the leader of everyone traveling with him. As they approached Egypt, Abram began thinking about a new concern that had nothing to do with food or pasture. The political structure of Egypt was very different from the loosely organized tribal societies of Canaan. Egypt was a powerful kingdom ruled by a pharaoh, whose authority extended across the land and whose officials carefully watched the arrival of foreign travelers. Abram knew that entering such a kingdom as a wealthy shepherd with a large household could attract attention, and the presence of his wife Sarai added another layer of uncertainty. Genesis explains that Sarai was a woman of remarkable beauty, and Abram feared that Egyptian officials might notice her when they arrived in the land. In the ancient world, powerful rulers sometimes took women into their households if they desired them, and Abram worried that the Egyptians might harm him in order to take Sarai for themselves. Concerned for his own safety, Abram spoke with Sarai before they entered the territory of Egypt and suggested a plan that would shape the events that followed. He asked Sarai to say that she was his sister rather than his wife. Abram believed that if the Egyptians thought Sarai was his sister, they would treat him favorably in order to maintain a relationship with her family rather than seeing him as an obstacle to be removed. The plan reflected Abram's attempts to protect himself in a situation where he feared the power of a foreign kingdom. Yet the decision also revealed a moment of human uncertainty within Abram's story, a reminder that even a man called by God could still struggle with fear and difficult choices. Soon, Abram and his household entered the land of Egypt, and the plan he had made to protect himself would lead to unexpected consequences. When Abram and his household finally entered Egypt, they arrived in a land very different from the open hills and valleys of Canaan. Egypt was an organized kingdom with established cities, large farming communities along the Nile River, and a powerful central authority under the rule of Pharaoh. Travelers entering such a land were often noticed quickly, especially if they arrived with large flocks, servants, and valuable possessions. Abram's caravan, moving slowly across the territory, would not have gone unnoticed by the officials responsible for monitoring activity along the borders and trade routes of the kingdom. Just as Abram had feared, the beauty of Sarai soon attracted attention among the Egyptians who observed the new arrivals. The biblical account explains that when officials connected to Pharaoh's household saw Sarai, they spoke about her beauty to the ruler himself. In a royal court where influential leaders often sought to bring remarkable people into their service or households, such reports quickly reached Pharaoh. Before long, Sarai was taken into Pharaoh's palace, where she became part of the royal household. Because Abram had presented Sarai as his sister, Pharaoh treated him with great generosity rather than suspicion. Abram was given livestock, servants, and other valuable resources as gifts connected to Sarai's presence within the royal household. From the outside, it appeared that Abram's plan had succeeded. He and his household were protected within the powerful kingdom of Egypt, and his wealth even increased through the gifts he received from Pharaoh. Yet the situation inside the palace was not unfolding as Abram had imagined. Genesis records that the Lord intervened in a way that revealed the truth of Sarai's relationship to Abram. The text states that serious troubles or plagues began affecting Pharaoh and the members of his household because Sarai was Abram's wife. Although the exact nature of these troubles is not described in detail, their impact was strong enough that Pharaoh eventually realized something was wrong. At some point, the truth became clear. The woman who had been brought into the palace was not Abram's sister, but his wife. Pharaoh summoned Abram and confronted him about the deception. The conversation must have been tense. Abram had entered Egypt as a traveler, seeking refuge from famine. Yet his actions had brought trouble upon the royal household of the most powerful ruler in the land. Pharaoh questioned Abram directly, asking why he had not told the truth about Sarai from the beginning. If the king had known she was Abram's wife, he would not have taken her into his household. Despite Abram's failure to speak honestly, Pharaoh chose not to harm him. Instead, he ordered Abram to take Sarai and leave Egypt immediately. The king instructed his officials to escort Abram and his household safely out of the land, ensuring that they departed without further conflict. Remarkably, Abram was allowed to keep the wealth he had received during his time in Egypt, including livestock, servants, and other resources that would strengthen his household as they returned north. The journey to Egypt had begun as an attempt to survive famine, but it ended as a moment that revealed both Abram's vulnerability and God's continuing protection over him. Even when Abram's own decisions placed him in a difficult position, the promise that had begun with God's call in Haran continued guiding the direction of his life. Abram and his household left Egypt and began traveling back toward Canaan, and the experiences he had gained along the way would shape the next stage of his journey in the land God had promised to show him. After leaving Egypt under Pharaoh's command, Abram and his household began the long journey back toward the land of Canaan. The caravan that moved northward through the desert regions now carried even greater wealth than when it had first entered Egypt. Abram possessed large flocks of sheep and cattle, donkeys for travel, camels for transporting supplies, and servants who worked under his leadership. What had begun as a journey to escape famine had unexpectedly increased the size and strength of Abram's household, preparing him for the next stage of life in the land God had promised. The return journey likely followed many of the same routes Abram had taken earlier when traveling south toward Egypt. Caravans often moved along established paths between water sources, stopping near wells or rivers where both people and animals could rest. Days would pass under the open sky as the caravans slowly crossed the dry landscapes that separated Egypt from the greener valleys of Canaan. At night, the travelers raised their tents beneath the stars while fires burned quietly in the darkness, and shepherds watched over the animals that formed the foundation of their wealth. Eventually, Abram and his household reached the region where he had previously camped between Bethel and Ai, the same place where he had built one of the altars marking his earlier encounters with God. Returning to this location carried deep meaning for Abram because it reminded him of the promise that had first drawn him into the land. Genesis records that Abram once again called upon the name of the Lord at the altar he had built there. The moment represented a renewal of the relationship that had begun when God first spoke to him in Haran. But Abram's growing prosperity soon created a new challenge within his own household. The flocks and herds belonging to Abram and his nephew Lot had multiplied so greatly that the land around him could no longer support both groups living together in the same area. Shepherds responsible for caring for the animals began competing for the same grazing land and water sources. Disputes started to arise between the herdsmen working for Abram and those working for Lot, creating tension within the extended family that had traveled together for so many years. Abram understood that continuing this conflict would only weaken the unity of the household. Rather than allowing resentment to grow between their people, he chose to address the problem directly. Abram approached Lot and suggested a peaceful solution that would allow both families to prosper without competing for the same land. The country around them was wide, and Abram believed there was enough space for each group to choose a different direction and establish their own territories. In a gesture that revealed Abram's character, he offered Lot the first choice. Lot could look across the land and decide where he wanted to settle, and Abram would then travel in the opposite direction. This decision showed Abram's willingness to trust that God's promise did not depend on controlling every opportunity for himself. Instead of grasping for the most fertile land, Abram allowed his nephew to choose first, confident that the God who had called him would continue guiding his future. Lot looked across the region and saw that the Jordan Valley was well-watered and fertile, resembling the richness of Egypt with its abundant vegetation. The area appeared ideal for supporting large flocks and herds, and Lot decided to move his household in that direction. Abram remained in the land of Canaan, settling among the hills while Lot traveled toward the fertile valley near the cities of the plain. The decision separated the two households and quietly reshaped the course of their futures. And soon after, Lot departed. God would speak to Abram again, reaffirming the promise that had first begun with a single call many years earlier. After Lot separated from Abram and traveled toward the fertile valley of the Jordan, the quiet hills of Canaan once again became Abram's home. The land around him stretched across rocky ridges, scattered trees, and open grazing areas where shepherds guided their flocks through the changing seasons. Without the tension that had grown between the herdsmen of Abram and Lot, the household returned to a calmer rhythm. Tents were raised near wells and pasture lands. Servants managed the growing flocks, and Abram continued living the life of a traveling patriarch in the land God had promised to show him. It was during this time, after Lot had gone his separate way, that the Lord spoke to Abram again. The separation from his nephew marked more than just a practical solution to a dispute over land. It also created a moment in which Abram stood alone as the central figure of the promise God had made. Genesis describes how God told Abram to lift his eyes and look in every direction, north, south, east, and west across the land that stretched before him. The message that followed expanded the promise Abram had first heard years earlier. God declared that all the land Abram could see would one day belong to his descendants forever. The promise also repeated the remarkable statement that Abram's offspring would become numerous beyond measure, in language meant to convey abundance rather than mathematical precision. God compared Abram's future descendants to the dust of the earth, suggesting that they would grow so numerous that counting them would be impossible. For Abram, these words must have carried a mixture of hope and mystery. He was still living as a wandering shepherd in a land controlled by other peoples, and he and Sarai remained without children. The promise of descendants as numerous as dust stood in striking contrast to the visible reality of his life. Yet the repeated assurances from God continued strengthening the path Abram had chosen to follow. God then instructed Abram to walk through the length and breadth of the land, observing the territory that would eventually belong to his descendants. This instruction was not a command to claim ownership immediately, but an invitation to explore the promise more deeply. By moving through the land itself, its hills, valleys, and plains, Abram would begin seeing the physical setting of the future God had described. In response, Abram moved his household once again, settling near the great trees of Mamre in the region of Hebron. This location would become one of the most important places associated with his life. Hebron stood in the hill country of southern Canaan, an area known for its ancient trees, fertile valleys, and strategic position among the routes connecting different parts of the land. As he had done before in other places where God had spoken to him, Abram built another altar there. The altar at Hebron symbolized both remembrance and trust. It marked the place where Abram acknowledged the growing promise that God had revealed across the years of his journey. Although Abram still lived in tents rather than cities, and although the land around him belonged to other tribes and communities, the promise continued unfolding step by step. And soon, events in the region would draw Abram into a conflict that would reveal another side of the man who walked with God. The region where Abram had settled near Hebron was not isolated from the political tensions that existed throughout the land of Canaan and the surrounding territories. During this period, the land was not controlled by a single unified kingdom, but by a network of small cities, each ruled by its own local king. These rulers governed fortified towns and the agricultural lands surrounding them, forming temporary alliances with neighboring cities when conflicts arose. Trade routes, fertile valleys, and access to water often determined the balance of power between these small kingdoms, and disputes over these resources sometimes erupted into military confrontations. Genesis records that such a conflict broke out among several kings ruling cities in the region surrounding the Jordan Valley, the very area where Lot had chosen to settle after separating from Abram. For years, the kings of cities such as Sodom, Gomorrah, Admah, Zeboim, and Bela had been under the authority of a powerful ruler named Kedorlaomer, king of Elam. This arrangement required them to pay tribute, likely in the form of goods, livestock, or agricultural products that were sent regularly as a sign of submission to the stronger kingdom. After 12 years under this arrangement, the kings of the Jordan Valley decided to rebel against Kedorlaomer's authority. Their refusal to continue paying tribute sparked a military response from the eastern kings who had once dominated the region. Kedorlaomer formed an alliance with other powerful rulers: Amraphel, king of Shinar, Arioch, king of Elasar, and Tidal, king of Goimon together. They marched westward to confront the rebellious cities. The campaign that followed swept through the region with force. The allied kings from the east defeated several groups along their path, before eventually reaching the valley where the rebellious cities were located. When the armies finally clashed in the valley of Siddim, the forces of the Jordan Valley cities were defeated. The invading kings captured goods, supplies, and people from the conquered cities, taking them as prisoners and spoils of war. Among those captured during this raid was Lot, Abram's nephew. Lot had settled near the city of Sodom, drawn by the fertile land of the valley. And when the invading armies defeated the region's kings, they seized the people and possessions of the cities. Lot and his household were taken, along with the others, as the victors began their journey back toward the east. News of the capture eventually reached Abram's camp near Hebron. A messenger arrived to report that Lot had been taken along with the people and possessions of the cities of the valley. Abram now faced a decision that would reveal the depth of his loyalty to his family. Although Lot had chosen to settle far from Abram and had established his own household among the cities of the valley, the bond between uncle and nephew remained strong. Abram did not hesitate. He gathered the trained men born within his house, whole 380 in number, and prepared to pursue the armies that had carried Lot away. Alongside his own men, Abram formed alliances with several local leaders in the region of Mamorah and Er and Esh. Together they set out to follow the path of the invading kings, traveling north in pursuit of the captives. What had begun as a regional conflict between distant kings was about to become something personal. Abram, the wandering shepherd who lived in tents, was now preparing to confront the armies that had captured his nephew. Abram's decision to pursue the armies that had captured Lot reveals an important aspect of his life that is sometimes overlooked when people think of him only as a wandering shepherd. Although he lived in tents and moved through the land with flocks and servants, Abram's household had grown into a large and organized community capable of defending itself. Genesis explains that Abram gathered 318 trained men who had been born within his household, men who were prepared to protect the people and property under Abram's leadership. These were not random travelers, but individuals who had likely spent years working together and who understood Abram's authority as the head of the household. After assembling these men, Abram began the pursuit of the invading armies that had taken Lot and the other captives. The route of the eastern kings led north through the land, and Abram followed their path carefully, moving quickly across the terrain with his small force. The journey required determination and strategic awareness, because Abram was facing a coalition of kings who had already defeated several armies during their campaign. Abram's group was smaller, but they possessed one advantage. They were highly motivated to rescue the captives and return them safely. The pursuit eventually brought Abram and his allies as far north as the region of Dan, near the upper reaches of the land. There, Abram devised a plan that relied not on overwhelming numbers, but on strategy. Instead of attacking the larger force directly in daylight, Abram divided his men and launched a surprise attack during the night. Under the cover of darkness, Abram and his allies struck the camp of the invading kings, creating confusion among the soldiers who had not expected pursuit from such a distance. The strategy proved effective. The sudden attack disrupted the eastern armies, forcing them into retreat. Abram and his men pressed the advantage, pursuing the fleeing forces even farther north toward Hobah, a location beyond the city of Damascus. During the chaos of the battle and the pursuit that followed, Abram succeeded in freeing the captives and recovering the goods that had been taken from the cities of the Jordan Valley. Among those rescued was Lot, along with the members of his household. Abram gathered the recovered people, animals, and possessions and began the journey back toward the land of Canaan. What had begun as a dangerous pursuit against powerful kings had ended in an unexpected victory. Abram, who had arrived in the land as a wandering shepherd guided only by a promise, had now demonstrated courage and leadership in a moment of conflict that affected many lives. When Abram returned from the victory, something unusual happened. As he approached the region near the Valley of Shava, also called the King's Valley, he was met by two figures who would play very different roles in the moment that followed. One was the king of Sodom, who had come out to greet Abram after the recovery of his people and possessions. The other was a mysterious figure whose appearance in the biblical story has fascinated readers for centuries. His name was Melchizedek, king of Salem. And the encounter that followed would reveal something profound about Abram's relationship with God. After the victory over the invading kings and the successful rescue of Lot and the other captives, Abram and his men began traveling back toward the southern regions of Canaan. The return journey must have been slower than the pursuit, because the group now included many rescued people, recovered livestock, and goods that had been taken during the raid. As the caravan moved through the valleys and plains of the land, word of Abram's unexpected victory spread quickly among the surrounding settlements. When Abram approached the valley of Shava, also known as the King's Valley, two leaders came out to meet him. One of them was the king of Sodom, whose people and possessions Abram had just recovered. The king had come to welcome Abram after the battle and to reclaim the goods and citizens that had been taken during the invasion. Yet before any discussion with the king of Sodom took place, another figure stepped forward, someone whose presence in the biblical account has captured the attention of readers for thousands of years. This man was Melchizedek, described in Genesis as the king of Salem and also as a priest of God Most High. Salem is widely understood to be an early name connected with the city that would later become Jerusalem, a place that would eventually hold deep significance in the history of Israel. Unlike the kings of the surrounding cities, who were defined mainly by political power or military strength, Melchizedek appeared in the narrative with a different kind of authority. He represented a priestly role connected directly to the worship of the one true God. Melchizedek approached Abram not with weapons or demands, but with hospitality. The biblical text explains that he brought bread and wine, offering refreshment to Abram and the men who had returned from battle. In the ancient world, sharing food and drink was a sign of peace, respect, and recognition of another person's role or achievement. This simple gesture acknowledged Abram's victory while also pointing to a deeper spiritual moment within the story. After offering bread and wine, Melchizedek spoke a blessing over Abram. He declared, "Blessed be Abram by God Most High, creator of heaven and earth, and praise be to God Most High, who delivered your enemies into your hand." These words recognized that Abram's victory had not come solely through human strength or strategy. Instead, Melchizedek pointed to the role of God in guiding and protecting Abram during the conflict. In response to this blessing, Abram did something that further demonstrated his recognition of God's authority. He gave a tenth of everything he had recovered to Melchizedek. This act, often referred to as giving a tithe, symbolized gratitude and acknowledgement that the victory and the wealth recovered ultimately belonged to God. The moment established a pattern that would later become an important practice in the worship life of Israel. After this encounter, the king of Sodom finally spoke to Abram. He offered Abram the recovered goods from the battle while requesting only that the rescued people be returned to him. From a practical perspective, Abram could have accepted these riches as a reward for his efforts in rescuing the captives. Yet Abram made a decision that revealed the depth of his trust in God's promise. He refused to take the wealth for himself. Abram explained that he had made a solemn commitment before God that he would not accept possessions that might allow others to claim they had made him rich. Abram wanted it to be clear that his future prosperity would come from the blessing of God alone rather than from the rewards of earthly kings. With this decision, Abram continued walking the path of trust that had begun years earlier when he first left Haran. And soon, God would speak to him, again revealing a covenant that would shape the future of nations. After the events surrounding the rescue of Lot and the encounter with Melchizedek, Abram returned to the quiet rhythms of life among the hills of Canaan. His household continued to grow in size and wealth, and the flocks under his care spread across the pastures of the land. From the outside, Abram's life appeared successful. He had demonstrated courage in battle, earned respect among the leaders of the region, and possessed enough animals and servants to maintain a thriving household. Yet beneath this outward stability remained a deeply personal question that had followed Abram for many years. Despite the promises God had spoken about future descendants, Abram and Sarai still had no child. In the ancient world, This reality carried far more weight than it might in modern societies. A man's legacy, property, and family identity were all closely tied to the presence of an heir who would inherit the household and continue the family line. Without a son, Abram faced the possibility that his entire household, his flocks, servants, and possessions would eventually pass to someone outside his immediate family. The promise of becoming the father of a great nation seemed increasingly difficult to understand when measured against the simple fact that he still had no child. Genesis describes how God spoke to Abram again during this period, addressing him with words meant to bring reassurance. The message began with a command not to fear. God told Abram, "Do not be afraid, Abram. I am your shield, your very great reward." These words emphasize that Abram's protection and future blessing did not depend on alliances with kings or the wealth he had gained through battle. Instead, God himself was the source of Abram's security and hope. Yet Abram responded honestly, revealing the concern that had been growing in his heart. He asked God how the promise of descendants could possibly be fulfilled when he remained childless. Abram explained that a servant within his household named Eliezer of Damascus would likely become his heir if no son were born. In the customs of the time, such arrangements were sometimes made when a man had no children to inherit his household. Abram's question was not one of rebellion, but of confusion. He was trying to understand how the promise God had spoken could become reality within the circumstances he could see. God answered Abram's concern with a powerful reassurance. He told Abram that the heir of the promise would not come from a servant within his household. Instead, Abram would have a son of his own, a child who would carry forward the promise that had begun years earlier when God first called him to leave Haran. To illustrate the magnitude of this promise, God led Abram outside and invited him to look up into the night sky. The desert sky above Canaan was clear and vast, filled with countless stars shining in the darkness. God then told Abram that his descendants would be as numerous as the stars he could see. The image must have been overwhelming. Standing beneath the immense sky, Abram faced a promise that extended far beyond his own lifetime. The countless stars above him symbolized generations yet to come, people who would one day trace their heritage back to the man standing quietly in the darkness of that ancient land. Genesis records Abram's response with a simple yet profound statement. Abram believed the Lord, and it was credited to him as righteousness. The promise had not yet been fulfilled, but Abram chose to trust the word of the God who had spoken. After Abram expressed his concern about having no heir and listened to the promise that his descendants would be as numerous as the stars, the conversation between Abram and God continued in a way that deepened the meaning of everything Abram had experienced since leaving Haran. Standing beneath the vast sky of Canaan, surrounded by the quiet landscape where his household had settled, Abram was not only hearing a promise about future generations, he was also being invited to understand the relationship between himself and the God who had guided his journey across the years. God spoke again and reminded Abram of something important about the path that had brought him to this moment. The Lord said, "I am the Lord, who brought you out of Ur of the Chaldeans to give you this land to take possession of it." These words connected the promise Abram had just heard to the earlier call that had begun his entire journey. The voice that spoke to him now was the same voice that had told him to leave his homeland and trust a future that had not yet been revealed. The journey from Ur to Haran, from Haran to Canaan, and through the events that had followed was part of a larger unfolding plan. Yet Abram once again spoke honestly about the questions still present in his mind. He asked how he could know with certainty that this land would truly belong to his descendants. The question did not deny the promise God had spoken. Rather, it reflected the natural desire of someone trying to understand how such a future could unfold in the world he could see around him. Abram was living among the Canaanites as a traveling shepherd, surrounded by cities and tribes who already occupied the land. From a human perspective, the promise of possession seemed distant and difficult to imagine. God responded by establishing a covenant, a solemn agreement that would confirm the promise in a visible and memorable way. In the ancient world, covenants were often sealed through symbolic rituals that represented the seriousness of the commitment being made. Abram was instructed to prepare several animals for this purpose: a heifer, a goat, a ram, and 2 birds. Following the instructions given to him, Abram arranged the animals in a specific way that reflected a traditional covenant ceremony used in that time. As evening approached and the sun began to set, Abram fell into a deep sleep, and a sense of awe and darkness surrounded him. During this moment, God revealed something about the future that Abram could not yet fully understand. The Lord explained that Abram's descendants would one day live as strangers in a foreign land, where they would be oppressed for many years before eventually being delivered and brought back to the land of promise. This statement pointed far ahead to events that would unfold centuries later in the history of Abram's descendants. Then, in the darkness of that night, Abram witnessed something extraordinary. Genesis describes how a smoking firepot and a blazing torch appeared and passed between the pieces of the animals. Abram had prepared. In the symbolism of the ancient covenant ritual, passing between the pieces represented a binding commitment between 2 parties. Yet in this moment, Abram himself did not pass between them. Instead, the presence representing God moved through the covenant ceremony, demonstrating that the fulfillment of the promise ultimately depended on God's faithfulness rather than Abram's ability to secure it on his own. Through this covenant, God reaffirmed that Abram's descendants would one day inherit the land stretching from the river of Egypt to the great river Euphrates. The promise that began with a call had now been sealed with a covenant. After the covenant had been established and the promise of countless descendants had been spoken beneath the night sky, Abram returned to the ordinary rhythm of life in the land of Canaan. Days passed into seasons, and seasons gradually became years as his household continued moving between the pastures and valleys of the region. The tents of Abram's camp rose and fell in different places as the flocks searched for grazing land, and the routines of shepherding, trading, and managing the large household filled the quiet flow of daily life. Yet beneath these familiar patterns remained the promise God had spoken, a promise that Abram believed, even though the visible signs of its fulfillment had not yet appeared. The passing years made the promise feel increasingly mysterious. Abram and Sarai were growing older, and the absence of a child continued to shape their thoughts about the future. In the ancient world, time carried special weight for families waiting for an heir. Each year that passed without a child could deepen the sense of uncertainty about what the future might hold. Abram remembered the stars he had seen the night God spoke about descendants beyond counting, yet the reality before him remained unchanged. His household was large and prosperous, but there was still no son who could inherit the promise. It was during this period of waiting that Sarai began thinking about a possible solution according to the customs of the time. In many ancient households, if a wife could not bear children, a servant could sometimes be given to the husband in order to produce an heir who would be considered part of the family. Sarai had an Egyptian servant named Hagar, who had likely joined the household during Abram's time in Egypt years earlier. As Sarai reflected on the years that had passed without a child, she proposed that Abram take Hagar as a secondary wife so that a child might be born through her. Abram listened to Sarai's suggestion and agreed to the plan. From the perspective of the cultural customs surrounding them, the decision may have seemed practical and reasonable. Yet the situation that followed soon revealed the emotional complexity of such arrangements. Hagar became pregnant, and the pregnancy quickly changed the relationships within the household. The biblical account explains that tension developed between Sarai and Hagar as the situation unfolded, creating conflict that had not existed before. As the tension increased, Sarai confronted Abram about the difficulties that had arisen between her and Hagar. Abram responded by allowing Sarai to address the situation according to her own judgment, acknowledging that Hagar remained her servant within the household. The conflict became intense enough that Hagar eventually fled from the camp, traveling into the wilderness where she found herself alone and uncertain about her future. It was there, in the desert, far from Abram's tents, that something remarkable happened. the angel of the Lord appeared to Hagar beside a spring of water along the road and spoke to her about the child she was carrying. The message explained that her son would be named Ishmael, meaning God hears, because the Lord had heard her distress. Hagar was instructed to return to Abram's household and raise the child there. The promise given to her also included a future for Ishmael as a descendant, showing that God's attention extended even into the complicated situations unfolding within Abram's family. Hagar returned to the camp and eventually gave birth to a son. Abram named the child Ishmael, just as the message had instructed. Yet even as the household welcomed this child, the deeper promise spoken by God still pointed towards something that had not yet happened. The story of Abram's family was not finished, and years later, God would speak again, revealing that the promised son had not yet been born. 13 years passed after the birth of Ishmael, and during that time Abram's household continued living among the hills and valleys of Canaan. The child grew within the camp, and from the perspective of everyday life, Ishmael appeared to be the long-awaited heir who would carry Abram's household into the future. Abram was now well advanced in age, and the idea that another child might be born seemed increasingly unlikely. The years had settled into a pattern of familiar responsibilities, caring for flocks, guiding servants, and maintaining relationships with neighboring communities that shared the land. Yet the promise God had spoken years earlier had not been forgotten, even if its fulfillment remained mysterious. When Abram was 99 years old, the Lord appeared to him once again and spoke words that would reshape the understanding of the covenant between them. God introduced himself with a declaration that emphasized his authority and power. "I am God Almighty. Walk before me faithfully and be blameless." The message called Abram not only to believe the promise, but to live a life that reflected trust in the God who had given it. This moment marked the beginning of a deeper stage in the covenant relationship that had begun years earlier when Abram first left his homeland. God then repeated and expanded the promise concerning Abram's future. The Lord declared that Abram would become the father of many nations, and that his descendants would multiply across generations. Yet this time the promise included a change that symbolized the new stage of the covenant. God told Abram that his name would no longer be Abram, which carried the meaning exalted father. Instead, he would be called Abraham, Anami Manning, father of many nations. The change in name reflected the future God had declared, a future that extended far beyond the life Abram had lived up to that point. The covenant also included a visible sign that would mark Abraham's household for generations to come. God established the practice of circumcision as a physical sign of the covenant between him and Abraham. His descendants, every male in Abraham's household, whether born within the family or brought into it as a servant, was to receive this sign as a reminder that they belonged to a people connected to God's promise. The practice would continue throughout the generations that followed, serving as a lasting symbol of the covenant relationship that began with Abraham. But the most surprising part of the message had yet to come. God told Abraham that the promise of a son would not be fulfilled through Ishmael. Instead, the child of the covenant would come through Sarai, his wife. Just as Abram's name had been changed, God also gave Sarai a new name. She would now be called Sarah, meaning princess, and through her the promised son would be born. God declared that kings and nations would descend from her line, expanding the promise far beyond the immediate household. The announcement must have been difficult to imagine. Abraham was nearly 100 years old, and Sarah had long passed the age when women typically bore children. The idea that they would now have a son together seemed almost impossible from a human perspective. Yet God made the promise clear. Within the next year, Sarah would give birth to a son, and his name would be Isaac. Isaac would be the child through whom the covenant promise would continue, and the life of Abraham, the man who walked with God, was about to enter its most extraordinary chapter. After the covenant of the new names had been established and the promise of a son through Sarah had been spoken, life in Abraham's camp continued beneath the wide skies of Canaan. The household remained settled near the great trees of Mamre, close to Hebron, where Abraham had pitched his tents among the rolling hills. and open grazing lands of the region. The land was quiet during much of the day, especially in the hours when the sun stood high above the hills and the heat slowed the movement of both people and animals. During those midday hours, travelers often rested in the shade of trees or within their tents, waiting for the cooler air of evening before continuing their journeys. One such day, while Abraham was sitting at the entrance of his tent during the heat of the afternoon, he looked up and noticed 3 men standing nearby. The appearance of travelers in the open land was not unusual in that time, because the ancient roads that crossed Canaan were frequently used by merchants, shepherds, and messengers moving between distant settlements. Yet something about these visitors immediately captured Abraham's attention. Without hesitation, he rose quickly from his place and approached them with the hospitality expected in the culture of the ancient Near East. Hospitality was considered a sacred responsibility among desert communities. Travelers depended on the kindness of strangers for food, water, and rest during long journeys across the land. Abraham bowed respectfully before the visitors and invited them to stop and refresh themselves rather than continuing on the road in the heat of the day. He offered water so they could wash their feet after the dust of travel and promised that food would be prepared so they might regain their strength before continuing their journey. The visitors accepted the invitation, and Abraham immediately began organizing the preparations for the meal. He hurried into the tent and spoke to Sarah, asking her to prepare bread from fine flour. Then he ran to the herd and selected a tender calf, giving it to a servant who prepared it quickly for cooking. Butter, milk, and the prepared meat were brought together and placed before the guests as Abraham stood nearby beneath the shade of the trees while they ate. The scene appears simple and peaceful, yet the conversation that followed revealed that these visitors were not ordinary travelers. After the meal had been served, one of the men asked Abraham a direct question. "Where's your wife Sarah?" Abraham answered that she was inside the tent. The visitor then spoke words that connected directly to the promise God had made earlier. He declared that he would return to Abraham about the same time the following year, and that Sarah would have a son. Inside the tent, Sarah was listening. The announcement must have sounded impossible to her. She and Abraham were both very old, and the years had long since passed when she expected to bear a child. The idea that such a promise could now become reality seemed beyond belief. Sarah responded quietly, laughing to herself at the thought that such a thing could happen. But the visitor who had spoken the promise knew what she had thought. And the moment that followed revealed that these guests were more than travelers passing through the land. When the visitor announced that Sarah would have a son within the coming year, the statement reached beyond the simple promise of a child. It touched directly upon the years of waiting, uncertainty, and quiet hope that had shaped Abraham and Sarah's lives. Inside the tent, Sarah listened carefully as the words were spoken outside among the trees where the guests sat with Abraham. The promise was clear and direct, yet it seemed almost impossible when measured against the realities she knew so well. Sarah and Abraham were both advanced in age, and Sarah had lived many years believing that motherhood would never come to her. The long seasons of waiting had gradually shaped her expectations about the future. She had watched the years pass while other families around them welcomed children and saw their households grow across generations. Even the earlier attempt to produce an heir through Hagar had come from a place of trying to solve the problem in a practical way. Yet the promise now spoken by the visitor pointed toward something that did not follow ordinary human expectations. Sarah laughed quietly to herself inside the tent. The laughter was not loud or openly spoken. It was the private reaction of someone who had spent years accepting the limits of what seemed possible. In her thoughts, she wondered how such a promise could come true when both she and Abraham were so old. From her perspective, the natural course of life had already moved beyond the season when children were born. But the visitor who had spoken the promise turned toward Abraham and asked a question that revealed he knew what Sarah had thought. He said, "Why did Sarah laugh and say, 'Will I really have a child now that I am old?'" The question carried a deeper meaning than simple curiosity. It exposed the quiet doubt that had risen in Sarah's mind and brought it into the open. Then the visitor followed with words that would echo throughout the biblical story as a reminder of God's power. "Is anything too hard for the Lord?" The question did not demand an answer from Abraham or Sarah. Instead, it pointed toward a truth that stood beyond human limitations. The promise of a son did not depend on the natural strength or age of the couple who would receive the child. It depended on the power of the God who had spoken the promise in the first place. What seemed impossible from a human perspective remained entirely possible for the one who had created the world and guided Abraham's journey from the beginning. When Sarah realized that the visitor had known about her private laughter, she became afraid and tried to deny it, saying that she had not laughed. Yet the response came back gently but firmly. "Yes, you did laugh." The moment was not meant to shame her, but to reveal that nothing within the camp, not even a silent thought inside a tent, was hidden from the God who had made the promise. Soon afterward, the visitors rose to continue their journey, turning their attention toward the region of Sodom, the city where Lot had settled years earlier. Abraham walked with them for a short distance, escorting them as hosts often did when guests departed. Yet before the travelers moved farther along the road, another moment unfolded, one that would reveal Abraham's role in a conversation about the future of the cities in the valley. And the promise of the son who would be called Isaac remained quietly waiting in the months that followed. After the visitors rose from the meal beneath the trees of Mamre and began traveling toward the region of Sodom, Abraham walked with them for a distance across the quiet landscape. In the ancient world, it was customary for a host to accompany departing guests for a part of their journey as a gesture of respect and hospitality. The road leading south from Abraham's camp passed through the hills overlooking the Jordan Valley, and from certain points along the ridge, the cities of the plain could be seen far below in the distance. It was during this walk that the conversation between Abraham and the visitors took an unexpected turn. One of the visitors, who spoke with the authority of the Lord, revealed that the outcry against the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah had become very great. Reports of wrongdoing and injustice had reached a level that demanded attention. The visitor explained that the situation in those cities would be examined, and if the reports proved true, judgment would follow. As the other two visitors continued traveling toward Sodom, Abraham remained standing before the Lord. The moment placed him in a unique position within the story. Abraham was not a ruler of the cities in the valley, nor did he control the actions of the people who lived there. Yet his nephew Lot had settled among them years earlier, and the thought of destruction coming upon those cities carried personal consequences for Abraham's family. Abraham approached the conversation carefully, speaking with both humility and boldness. He asked a question that reflected his understanding of God's justice. "Will you sweep away the righteous with the wicked?" The question carried deep significance. Abraham was not arguing against justice itself, but he wondered whether innocent people living among the cities might be destroyed along with those responsible for wrongdoing. His concerns centered on whether the presence of righteous individuals could spare the city from destruction. Then Abraham began presenting a series of appeals. He asked whether the city would be spared if 50 righteous people could be found within it. The Lord responded that if 50 righteous people were present in Sodom, the entire city would be spared for their sake. Encouraged by this response, Abraham continued speaking, carefully lowering the number each time. What if there were 45? What if there were 40? Then 30? Then 20? Each time the Lord answered that the city would be spared if that number of righteous people could be found. Finally, Abraham asked about the possibility of just 10 righteous people within the city. The Lord replied that even for the sake of 10, the city would not be destroyed. The conversation ended there, and the Lord departed while Abraham returned to his camp in the hills. The exchange revealed something important about Abraham's relationship with God. He spoke with humility, recognizing his own human limitations. Yet he also demonstrated the courage to ask difficult questions about justice and mercy. Abraham stood as an intercessor, someone willing to speak on behalf of others, even when the outcome remained uncertain. Meanwhile, the two visitors who had left earlier continued their journey toward the city of Sodom, where Lot lived, and the events that would unfold there would soon bring Abraham's concerns into painful reality. After the events surrounding the cities of the plain had unfolded and the years continued moving forward, the promise that God had spoken beneath the trees of Mamre remained quietly present in Abraham's household. The seasons continued their steady rhythm across the land of Canaan. Shepherds guided flocks between pastures. Servants carried out their daily work, and the tents of Abraham's camp stood among the hills where the family had lived for many years. Yet even within these ordinary routines, the words spoken by the Lord about a son through Sarah had not been forgotten. Time passed until the moment God had promised finally arrived. Genesis records the fulfillment of the promise in direct and simple language. The Lord remembered Sarah and did for her exactly what he had said would happen. Sarah became pregnant and gave birth to a son for Abraham in his old age, at the very time God had announced earlier. The long years of waiting, doubt, and hope had led to a moment that once seemed impossible. Abraham, who'd once stood beneath the stars hearing about descendants beyond counting, now held in his arms the child through whom that promise would continue. The child was named Isaac, a name meaning he laughs. The name carried deep significance because it echoed the moment when Sarah had laughed quietly inside the tent when she first heard the promise. What once sounded unbelievable had now become reality. The laughter that had once expressed doubt now became a symbol of joy and astonishment at what God had done. Abraham obeyed the instructions that had been given earlier regarding the covenant, and when Isaac was 8 days old, he was circumcised as a sign of the agreement between God and Abraham as a descendant. The moment connected the birth of Isaac directly to the covenant that had been established years before when Abram as Aname had been changed to Abraham and Sarai had been renamed Sarah. Sarah herself spoke words that reflected both amazement and gratitude. She said that God had brought laughter to her life, and that everyone who heard about the birth of Isaac would share in that joy. The thought that she would nurse a child in her old age had once seemed beyond imagination. Yet the promise had unfolded exactly as God had spoken. For Abraham, the birth of Isaac marked the beginning of a new chapter in the journey that had started decades earlier, when he left the city of Ur. The promise of descendants was no longer only a future vision symbolized by the stars in the sky. It now had a living beginning in the child growing within the tents of his household. Yet even within this moment of joy, the story of Abraham's family still contained complexities that would soon require difficult decisions. Ishmael, the son born through Hagar years earlier, was now growing older within the camp. And the presence of 2 sons within Abraham's household would soon lead to a moment that would test the peace of the family and the direction of the promise. As the years passed after the birth of Isaac, Abraham's camp gradually adjusted to the new reality of life with a long-awaited son of promise. The tents of the household were filled with a different kind of energy, now that a child had been born to Abraham and Sarah in their old age. Servants who had once wondered whether the household would ever see an heir now watched the young boy grow, and the flocks continued grazing across the hills of Canaan as life slowly settled into a new rhythm. Isaac grew from infancy into childhood under the watchful care of his parents and the extended household that surrounded them. In the culture of the ancient Near East, the early years of a child's life were marked by important moments of celebration, including the time when the child was fully weaned from his mother's care. Genesis records that when Isaac was finally weaned, Abraham prepared a great feast to mark the occasion. The celebration reflected both the joy of the household and the significance of the child whose birth had once seemed impossible. Yet within the camp, the presence of Isaac also changed the balance of relationships that had existed before his birth. Years earlier, Ishmael had been the only son in Abraham's household, the child who appeared to represent the future of the family. But now, Isaac held the central place in the promise that God had spoken to Abraham and Sarah. The shift in this role created tension that soon became visible within the family. During the time of the celebration for Isaac, Sarah noticed something that deeply troubled her. Genesis explains that she saw Ishmael, the son of Hagar the Egyptian, behaving in a way that caused concern. The text does not describe every detail of what happened, but Sarah interpreted the moment as a sign that Ishmael's presence could threaten Isaac's position within the household. From Sarah's perspective, the future of the promise given to Abraham needed to remain clearly connected to her own son. As a result, Sarah approached Abraham with a request that placed him in an extremely difficult position. She asked that Hagar and Ishmael be sent away from the household. Sarah insisted that the son of the servant should not share in the inheritance that belonged to Isaac. The request forced Abraham to face a painful decision. Ishmael was not simply the child of a servant. He was Abraham's son, a boy who had grown within his household for many years. The situation weighed heavily on Abraham's heart. Genesis describes how deeply distressed Abraham felt about the matter because it involved his son. The tension between protecting the future of Isaac and caring for Ishmael created a moment of emotional struggle within the household. Abraham had lived long enough to see the promise of Isaac fulfilled, yet the path forward now required choices that affected the lives of both boys. In the midst of this difficult moment, God spoke to Abraham again. The message reassured him that Isaac was the son through whom the covenant promise would continue, but it also included a reminder that Ishmael would not be forgotten. God told Abraham that Ishmael too would become the father of a nation because he was Abraham's descendant. The next morning, Abraham prepared provisions for Hagar and her son, and the story of the household would soon move toward the most difficult test Abraham would ever face. After the difficult moment in which Hagar and Ishmael were sent away from the household, life in Abraham's camp once again settled into a quieter rhythm. Isaac continued growing under the care of Abraham and Sarah, and the child gradually became the center of the family's hopes for the future. The promise that had once seemed distant and uncertain now lived in the presence of the boy who ran among the tents and fields where Abraham's flocks grazed. Years earlier, Abraham had stood beneath the night sky listening to God speak about descendants as numerous as the stars. Now the promise had taken its first visible form in the life of Isaac. Time continued moving forward, and Isaac grew old enough to walk beside his father and observe the responsibilities that shaped life in a pastoral household. Abraham had spent decades guiding flocks, managing servants, and traveling across the land God had promised to show him. Isaac would have watched these routines closely, learning the patterns of life that one day he might inherit as the leader of the family. The bond between father and son likely grew through shared journeys across the hills and valleys of Canaan, as they moved between grazing lands and campsites. Then, at a moment that came without warning, God spoke to Abraham again. Genesis introduces this moment with a simple but powerful statement. After these things, God tested Abraham. The word test reveals that what followed was not meant to destroy Abraham, but to examine the depth of the faith that had guided his life since leaving him many years earlier. The voice that had once promised descendants now spoke a command that seemed almost impossible to understand. God called Abraham by name, and Abraham answered in the familiar way he had responded before. "Here I am." Then the command was given. God told Abraham to take his son, his only son Isaac, the child whom he loved, and travel to the region of Moriah. There he was, to offer Isaac as a burnt offering on a mountain that God would show him. The words must have struck Abraham with enormous weight. Isaac was not only his beloved son, but also the child through whom the promise of future generations was supposed to unfold. The command seemed to stand in direct tension with everything God had previously promised about Isaac's future. Yet the biblical account describes Abraham's response with quiet simplicity. Early the next morning, Abraham prepared for the journey. He saddled his donkey, gathered wood for the offering, and called 2 of his servants to travel with him. Isaac also joined the group as they set out toward the land God had named. The small caravan began moving across the hills and valleys of the region, traveling toward a destination Abraham did not yet fully understand. The journey lasted 3 days. During those long hours of travel, Abraham had time to think about the command he had received and the promise that seemed connected to Isaac's life. The road stretched ahead across the rugged landscape, and the silence of the journey may have deepened the weight of the decision he was carrying. On the 3rd day, Abraham looked up and saw the mountain in the distance, and the final steps of the test were about to begin. After the difficult moment in which Hagar and Ishmael were sent away from the household, life in Abraham's camp once again settled into a quieter rhythm. Isaac continued growing under the care of Abraham and Sarah, and the child gradually became the center of the family's hopes for the future. The promise that had once seemed distant and uncertain now lived in the presence of the boy who ran among the tents and fields where Abraham's flocks grazed. Years earlier, Abraham had stood beneath the night sky, listening to God speak about descendants as numerous as the stars. Now the promise had taken its first visible form in the life of Isaac. Time continued moving forward, and Isaac grew old enough to walk beside his father and observe the responsibilities that shaped life in a pastoral household. Abraham had spent decades guiding flocks, managing servants, and traveling across the land God had promised to show him. Isaac would have watched these routines closely, learning the patterns of life that one day he might inherit as the leader of the family. The bond between father and son likely grew through shared journeys across the hills and valleys of Canaan, as they moved between grazing lands and campsites. Then, at a moment that came without warning, God spoke to Abraham again. Genesis introduces this moment with a simple but powerful statement. After these things, God tested Abraham. The word test reveals that what followed was not meant to destroy Abraham, but to examine the depth of the faith that had guided his life since leaving here many years earlier. The voice that had once promised descendants now spoke a command that seemed almost impossible to understand. God called Abraham by name, and Abraham answered in the familiar way he had responded before. "Here I am." Then the command was given. God told Abraham to take his son, his only son Isaac, the child whom he loved, and travel to the region of Moriah. There he was, to offer Isaac as a burnt offering on a mountain that God would show him. The words must have struck Abraham with enormous weight. Isaac was not only his beloved son, but also the child through whom the promise of future generations was supposed to unfold. The command seemed to stand in direct tension with everything God had previously promised about Isaac's future. Yet the biblical account describes Abraham's response with quiet simplicity. Early the next morning, Abraham prepared for the journey. He saddled his donkey, gathered wood for the offering, and called 2 of his servants to travel with him. Isaac also joined the group as they set out toward the land God had named. The small caravan began moving across the hills and valleys of the region, traveling toward a destination Abraham did not yet fully understand. The journey lasted 3 days. During those long hours of travel, Abraham had time to think about the command he had received and the promise that seemed connected to Isaac's life. The road stretched ahead across the rugged landscape, and the silence of the journey may have deepened the weight of the decision he was carrying. On the 3rd day, Abraham looked up and saw the mountain in the distance, and the final steps of the test were about to begin. When Abraham finally saw the mountain in the distance on the 3rd day of the journey, the moment must have carried a deep sense of weight and finality. The land around them stretched across hills and valleys that Abraham had traveled many times during his years in Canaan. Yet this journey was unlike any he had taken before. The command he carried from God remained clear in his mind, and each step toward the mountain brought him closer to the moment that command would require. Abraham stopped the small group that had been traveling with him and turned to the 2 servants who had accompanied them. He told them to remain where they were with the donkey, while he and Isaac continued the journey up the mountain alone. His words to the servants were brief, but revealing. Abraham said that he and the boy would go up to worship and then return. The statement reflected the confidence Abraham still carried within him, even though the path ahead seemed impossible to understand. After speaking with the servants, Abraham prepared for the final part of the journey. He placed the wood for the burnt offering onto Isaac's shoulders, while he himself carried the fire and the knife that would be used for the sacrifice. Together, father and son began walking up the mountain, leaving the others behind at the base of the hill. The quiet path upward gave them time to think, and the silence of the moment was eventually broken by Isaac. The boy asked a simple and logical question. Looking at the items they were carrying, Isaac said, "The fire and the wood are here, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering?" It was the kind of question a child might naturally ask while preparing for a sacrifice, because animals were normally brought along for such rituals. Isaac could see the materials needed for the offering, yet he noticed that the most important element, the animal itself, was missing. Abraham answered with words that have echoed throughout the biblical story ever since. He said, "God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son." The response did not fully explain what was about to happen, but it revealed Abraham's continuing trust in the God who had guided his life for so many years. The 2 of them continued walking together until they reached the place God had shown Abraham on the mountain. When they arrived, Abraham began preparing the altar for the sacrifice. He arranged the stones and placed the wood carefully upon them. Then, with a heavy heart yet steady obedience, Abraham bound Isaac and laid him upon the altar on top of the wood. The moment stood at the very edge of the test that God had declared. Abraham raised the knife in his hand. The promise that had begun with the stars in the sky and the birth of Isaac now stood suspended in a single moment of obedience. And at that exact moment, a voice called out from heaven. After the journey to the mountain of Moriah and the test that had revealed the depth of Abraham's faith, life slowly returned to the quiet rhythm of the hills of Canaan. The tents of Abraham's household once again stood among the valleys and grazing lands where his flocks moved through the changing seasons. Years earlier, Abraham had walked these same hills as a traveler who had only recently arrived in the land God promised to show him. Now he lived there as an aging patriarch whose life had become deeply connected to the story unfolding across the land. Isaac continued to grow into adulthood, becoming the central figure of the future God had promised. The boy who once carried the wood up the mountain beside his father now learned the responsibilities of guiding the household that one day would become his own. Abraham had spent decades leading servants, managing livestock, and moving carefully across the territories of different tribes. These were the lessons Isaac would gradually inherit as he prepared to carry the covenant promise into the next generation. During these years, another important moment came into Abraham's life. Sarah, who had walked beside him through the long journey from Haran and had witnessed the miraculous birth of Isaac in her old age, eventually passed away. Genesis records that Sarah died in Hebron, in the land of Canaan, after living a long life. Her death marked a deeply personal loss for Abraham, who had shared with her the uncertainties, hopes, and promises that shaped their journey for so many years. For the first time since entering Canaan, Abraham needed to secure a permanent piece of land within the region. Up to this point, he had lived as a traveler among the Canaanite communities, moving with his flocks and settling temporarily in different places. But now he sought a burial place where Sarah could be laid to rest. Abraham approached the local people known as the Hittites, who lived in the region near Hebron, and respectfully asked to purchase a piece of land where he could bury his wife. The conversation that followed revealed the respect Abraham had gained among the people of the land. The Hittites referred to him as a mighty prince among them, acknowledging the influence and character he had demonstrated during his years living in their territory. Eventually, Abraham purchased the cave of Machpelah, along with the surrounding field from a man named Ephron the Hittite. The transaction was completed publicly before witnesses at the city gate, following the customs used for property agreements in the ancient world. The cave became the first piece of land Abraham officially owned in the territory God had promised to his descendants. Sarah was buried there. The cave of Machpelah would later become the burial place of Abraham himself, as well as several other key figures in the generations that followed. In this quiet moment of grief and remembrance, Abraham secured a small but meaningful foothold in the land where God's promise would one day grow into a nation. The journey of the man who walked with God was slowly approaching its final years. But before Abraham's life came to its close, he still had one more important responsibility to ensure the future of the son through whom the covenant promise would continue. After Sarah was buried in the cave of Machpelah near Hebron, Abraham turned his attention to one final responsibility that would shape the future of the covenant God had promised. Isaac had grown into adulthood, and Abraham understood that the continuation of the family line depended on Isaac establishing his own household. In the world of the ancient Near East, marriages were often arranged with careful attention to family background, alliances, and shared cultural traditions. Abraham did not want Isaac to marry among the Canaanite tribes living around them, because the covenant promise had always been connected to the family line that began in the land of his ancestors. For that reason, Abraham called one of his most trusted servants and gave him an important task. The servant was instructed to travel back toward the region where Abraham's relatives still lived, far to the north near the lands of Mesopotamia, and there find a wife for Isaac from among Abraham's extended family. The journey would be long and uncertain, but Abraham believed that God, who had guided his entire life, would also guide the servant in this mission. The servant prepared for the journey with camels and valuable gifts that could be offered to the family of the woman who might become Isaac's wife. Traveling across the long trade routes that connected Canaan to Mesopotamia, the servant eventually arrived near the town where Abraham's relatives lived. The story that follows in Genesis describes how he prayed for guidance and waited near a well, where women from the town came to draw water. There he met Rebekah, whose actions and character quickly convinced the servant that she was the one God had chosen. Rebekah welcomed the servant with generosity and kindness, offering water not only to him, but also to his camels. After learning that she belonged to Abraham's extended family, the servant explained the purpose of his journey and the promise connected to Isaac's future. Rebekah's family agreed to the marriage, and she eventually traveled back with the servant to the land of Canaan. When Isaac met Rebekah, the new chapter of Abraham's family began to unfold. The covenant promise that had once seemed uncertain now continued into the next generation. Abraham had lived long enough to see the beginning of that future take shape. The son who had once been laid upon the altar on Mount Moriah was now prepared to carry forward the story God had begun many years earlier. In his later years, Abraham continued living among his household in the land of Canaan, surrounded by the descendants, servants, and flocks that had grown through decades of wandering and settlement. Genesis records that Abraham lived to the age of 175 years. When his life finally came to an end, his sons Isaac and Ishmael came together to bury him in the cave of Machpelah beside Sarah, the same burial place Abraham had purchased years earlier. The man who once left the city of Ur without knowing where the journey would lead had now reached the end of a life shaped by faith, obedience, and the unfolding promise of God. Abraham never saw the countless descendants described beneath the stars on that night in Canaan. Yet the promise continued through Isaac, and through generations that would follow long after Abraham's lifetime had ended. His story became one of the foundational accounts of the Bible, the journey of a man who listened to God's call, walked across unknown lands, and trusted a promise that would shape the future of nations.